People who attended last week have also logged on again today, so that's the best feedback that we could get, really. Thank you very much. It's good to have you with us again. For those of you who weren't with us last week, though, just a few introductions. My name is Danni Starley, and I'm the Group Operations Director at Succeed Partnership. I have quite a varied background, but I will start off by saying, first of all, that I'm an adopter. I'm a therapeutic parent, as much as I can be. I'm especially a social worker, and I've been working with children in care for 23 years. It makes me feel really old when I say that. But I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today, and I thought I would introduce you to our two fabulous speakers. So, Lesley first.
Welcome. My name is Lesley Hanney. I'm a consultant systemic psychotherapist, and I'm also an adopted parent. I've been working in children's mental health for 20 years and a bit more. And I specialise working with adoption and fostering, and I'm the clinical director of Succeed.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Jill Hanney. I am a psychotherapist. My main job is in CAMS, where I specialise in trauma, but I'm also a foster carer and try to be a therapeutic foster carer, but sometimes I don't succeed.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, so as last week, there will be a time for questions and answers at the end. So if you've got any questions, just send them in and we will get to them at about 10 to 2. Okay, Jill, let's start with you. So last week, we briefly mentioned about developmental trauma. And I just wondered if we could talk a bit about what is that? How is it different from other traumas? Maybe people have heard of things like PTSD. Is this the same or how is it different?
Okay, so the older history of trauma and our understanding of trauma would be very much like if you say you're traumatized, people would say, well, what happened? It's very event-based. And PTSD tends to be like a single incident trauma, and there would have been an event.
Yeah.
I think whilst complex trauma is an event after an event after an event. So if say for instance a domestic violence situation, maybe to complex trauma because there's many events. But then when we're talking about developmental trauma happens before the baby has a thinking brain. It happens during the attachment period, and there isn't so much an incident. So say for instance, if you have a mum who's depressed, and we always tend to blame the mums, but yeah, it's usually mum's the main carer. If a mum's depressed, and when the baby seeks her eyes and mum's not making eye contact, or mum's not available, or baby's left to cry, or baby's left hungry, whilst us three sitting here, if I'm hungry, that's not exactly traumatic. It may be very nice, but it's not exactly traumatic. To a baby whose ability to assess risk is very limited, that very quickly rises to a death, level of death. Because if babies are left, they die. So if a baby's left hungry, if it's left not picked up, it's not cuddled, it's not got any attention, that is developmental trauma. And it happens during the time when the baby's brain is developing at its fastest rate. And that's about, I think, 90% of brain growth happens in the first 3 years of life.
But are we also talking about in utero as well, isn't it? Because it isn't just from birth. This is
some really interesting work by a Canadian psychiatrist, a guy called Gabor Mate. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right. And he talks about addiction, and he talks about things like schizophrenia and sort of a lot of mental health. And the belief was that it was an inherited, addiction was inherited. You've got that gene, schizophrenia is inherited. Because they found this out by doing the studies of the twins. Twins separated at birth, both go on to develop schizophrenia. Therefore, the argument was that it was inherited. Right. But in actual fact, what Gabor Mate was saying is that these twins had the same environment for 9 months. And any mother who's giving up twin babies is a stressed mum. So these babies are already born stressed, even though you separate them. So those 9 months in the womb have created babies who maybe their heart rate's faster, they're more agitated, they're less easy to settle, and then you impact that with an already stressed mum, and then you think about the attachment process.
So the chemicals, isn't it? Sorry, the chemicals that are coming that are very normal for someone who's stressed goes into the baby and changes the structure of the brain.
The baby's brain develops in response to the environment.
Yeah, so it's use dependent.
User dependent. And it's if mum's unavailable just one day, or she's a bit stressed. It's not going to do any harm, but it's the repetitive incidents, repetitive small incidents of unavailability, of being left, of being scared, frightened. And that causes the brain to change. It changes the architecture.
I just can't help thinking about some of our children who come into care quite early on in their life, but come to us many kind of placements down the road, and people kind of struggle to kind of get a handle on why. And I'm thinking about, kind of maybe issues around domestic abuse when the mum's pregnant that kind of are in the chronology of the story, but kind of get overlooked or skimmed over, but actually you're saying that would have a massive impact.
The baby's on the baby's born frightened.
Wow.
The baby's already born hyper alert, hyper vigilant, already scared. It is some really interesting research on the babies that were born to mothers who were pregnant during the 9/11 bombings. And these are babies that were loved, but those mothers were very stressed. And they found a high incidence of babies' smaller birth weight, not being able to latch on, and high incidence of things like ASC and ADHD later on. And this was just because of the bombings, and these are really stressed mothers. It's quite interesting. Absolutely, it changes the brain.
Wow. So, I mean, that's quite a big task. That has a massive impact on all of the families that Certainly Succeed Partnership are involved in or working with.
And I also think one of the difficulties for the children is, like a child, how horrendous it is. A child, if they can latch their internal agitation on to the fact that maybe, a mother died or they were, beaten or something, they have an understanding. Children can get their heads around that. How does a child understand the impact of nothing, the impact of neglect? They can't. They can't get their heads around that. And I think that's harder for children to understand because they can't talk it away, can they?
Yeah.
They can't talk about nothing because it was the lack of something that caused the damage, and I don't think they understand it.
But it's also pre-verbal, a lot of what we're talking about, isn't it? So there is not pre-verbal.
So how do they make sense of it? How do they make sense of something that happened before they have a memory that's had such an impact on their brain? One of the analogies I quite like my analogies, because they make sense to me, is if you imagine a car and there's a car crash and the bumper's bent in, that's PTSD. One of the window screens smashed or something, that's PTSD. But the engine of the car, if the engine of the car is broken, that is developmental trauma. It's the actual, PTSD happens usually to a brain that's already developed. Developmental trauma happens to the very engine of the brain. It happens as it's being wired, as it's developing, it changes the brain.
So because it's such a kind of fundamental thing, it's a biological change to the brain development. Is that it forever then? Are these babies born with?
Well, there's something called neuroplasticity, which is the understanding, used to be, and I don't know whoever said this, I would say it's Winston Churchill, but it probably isn't. Whoever said, show me the child at the age of 3 and I'll show you the man.
Right, yeah.
Churchill?
I think it was Freud, actually.
Winston Churchill, Freud, who cares?
One of them,
Yeah.
white man.
Yeah, someone, white man, someone. But now they understand neuroplasticity, which means the brain can be rewired, but in response to repetition. One good experience is not going to change. So often I work with foster carers who's got a child who's been in placement for 5 years, and they're saying, well, why are they still weeing in the wardrobe, or why are they still stealing and storing food, whatever? And I'm saying because even though this child may cognitively know now they're safe, the wiring in their brain when they were 2 years old was either, you're not safe, you need to hide food. But bit by bit, new synaptic connections can be formed. And it goes on until, I think, if I get this right, it's 300 a second, no, it might be 700 a second during the early years, and it goes down to about 300 when you get old, like me.
It doesn't work at all.
It doesn't work. It just dies off.
So the younger the child, the more hope there is, more opportunity there is to.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think what happens is that the younger the child is exposed to the trauma, the bigger the impact.
Yeah.
The sooner you're out of that, the more ability to change.
Okay.
So it has two ways of thinking about it. So when people say to me, you know, well, they were adopted at birth, what, you know, that, but actually that transition, the in utero experience has repercussions. It does. It's wired into the brain because the brain is use dependent. So it's the more intense, the younger, the quicker we can place the child into a safe place, the better the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a supervising social worker, I used to help the foster families think about kind of like the percentage of experiences that child had, so how old the child was and how much of their life had been exposed to kind of unsafe, unhelpful experiences and how much hadn't, to try and get them to understand that just because they've been with you for 6 months now doesn't mean all of this has gone away. So is that a helpful kind of?
I think so, but I think the difficulty is getting your head round that the impact is so great in the first few years. So when people say, well, they were only in that environment for a year and they've been with me in a good environment for 10 years, why has that not made a difference? Because the damage happened when the brain was growing its fastest rate. And that's the difficulty. And if the brain isn't gone into a survival mode, just trying to focus on survival, the upper regions of the brain don't work. They have not come online so much. So that's why the damage is, and I think that's really hard for people to understand.
Actually, last week we talked very briefly around the different stages of the brain development, but I'm very mindful we've got a few people today who didn't necessarily see last week's. So could you just, you know, I like your hand explanation, kind of explain about the brain and the stages of development and why it's relevant to this.
Bear in mind, I am not medically trained.
No.
And this is a simplification.
Yeah, that's why I like it.
So this is the brain. This is the brainstem, yeah? And this is the reptilian brain. And a baby's born functioning from this part of the brain. And the language of this part of the brain is impulses and sensations. And then so it's a baby's the attachment, it's the sort of temperature, the hunger, everything, the heartbeat, everything is functioning here.
So people might think of it as primitive
Reptilian brain.
Right, okay,
This is the reptilian brain. And then the next part of the brain, this is the mammalian brain. And the language of this part of the brain is emotions. It's where emotions are held, perception. And in here is the amygdala, which is like the alarm system of the brain. It's the danger, it's the perception of danger happens here. And this part is the higher cortical functioning. I mean, bear in mind, this is a very, very simplified execution.
That's good.
If I had a surgeon explain to me I'm going to cut there, I'd be a bit worried. But this part of the brain is the higher cortical functioning, is where thinking happens, where problem solving, it all happens here. So the baby's functioning here.
The consequences would be
consequences here.
So you've done this, so you've done this behaviour. The consequences is dealing with that part of the brain.
Yeah, and problem solving.
Yeah.
So when someone comes up to a child in the playground and goes, "Your mum doesn't love you, that's during care," this part of the brain is not on fine. So the idea of being able to say problem solve, I've got a problem, should I tell my mother, or should I tell the teacher, should I say something funny, should I punch? There's no problem solving. This is not online, so they punch. So the baby's born here, and the brain develops bottom up. So it has to come from this part of the brain to this part of the brain to come from. And the thing about trauma is not held in this part of the brain where verbal language is held, which is why you can't talk away trauma
Or reassure
trauma.
Yeah.
Because there's no language. There's no language because this part of the brain is shut down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were talking last week about the bottom-up brain development, and we were talking about the need to respond to the senses, being a sensory detective, which is still my phrase of the week. But I guess, you know, people might be thinking, okay, so we understand how the child's kind of trauma has affected them. We understand how it's kind of changed their brain map, changed their brain development. You know, what do we do? What can we do?
Well, I suppose going along with analogies, the analogy that I always use is that if you just take, and again, I'm going to really simplify it. If you take a child who's been exposed to enormous degrees of aggression, there's a neuro pathway that's been developed in their brain in a use-dependent way, like a motorway. There's aggression, here's the neuron to that experience, and so it's like a motorway. Whereas the other...
To add to that, The motorways that are used the most in the brain get covered with something called a myelin sheath, which means, if we're going to use your analogy, the cars can go even quicker on that motorway.
Yeah.
Because the electrical impulses travel faster. So if it's a response to fight, flight, freeze, whatever it is, that will be covered by a myelin sheath.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, I'm not medically trained.
So we've got cars skidding along the motorway, basically.
Yeah.
So when a child experiences something that could, upset them, that neural pathway absolutely at heightened speed. So therefore, you're working with draw. Then they go from there's no, because they're moving along this. There is another route there, but that route is this country path that has not been walked along, not been treaded. It's got dandelions and weeds and, stinging nettles along it, but it's there. And what we need to do is walk that path and be thinking about that path. But we are building a path, motorway, where it's much faster and much.
Yeah.
So it's about the thinking about how we can help that child begin to trample that other path. So that path begins to move so there's your analogy.
Yeah,
I'm going to steal that analogy.
But it's making me think of so my son, he would quite often go from 0 to 100, in terms of a meltdown about something. And I found myself, it wasn't a deliberate kind of decision, I found myself saying, use your words. And then I realised that's ridiculous because he doesn't actually have those words.
Yes.
So I've had to take myself a step back, and I feel like I'm walking down the path with him because I'm trying to give him the words. I'm suggesting how it might feel and what he might be feeling. So this is me learning and putting it into practice.
Exactly.
Is that I thought I was being therapeutic by not jumping at the behaviour and kind of giving a consequence, but saying, come on, use your words. And actually I've realised what I need to do is help give him the words and slow down his brain. I'm trying to slow him down so that he can.
So what you're going to be doing is making a smart motorway. You're going to be building some traffic lights. You're going to be putting some traffic jams in the way.
Yeah.
Slowly going to be putting some kind of a police car with its speeding camera.
Speed awareness.
Speed awareness training. You're going to be sent off to speed awareness training. So you're going to have all of these things that are going to be put in place through time and repeating. So you are then helping show him the other path and walk that path. And the other thing that people do is say, why? Why are you doing that? And I can put my hands up, I often do that. I think, well, I'm asking a child why they're doing something when they don't have the capacity to have the words to what they're doing. They don't really understand why they're doing it because they're actually in the trauma response. And so therefore they will either tell me something that isn't the truth,
Just to get me to be quiet.
to give an answer, to kind of, to respond. So it is really very much about rewiring the brain. You are changing biology, and it doesn't happen overnight. So with kids that are born and stay within their own family, you might say to them, please don't throw all your towels on the floor afterwards. You might say that quite a lot probably, but with a child who's had trauma, you have to do it again and again and again and again, because they're just.
Well, maybe I think with a child who's had the trauma, maybe you go and pick up the towels with them.
Yeah.
You walk that path with them. And I think it's our job as adults, developmentally mature adults, to help the children make sense of their internal world. So when you think about your little girl, your job has been, and I've seen you do it time and time again, is to say, I wonder if you dropped all those towels because you're feeling a bit sad or a bit angry or whatever. And it's our job to maybe help them find the words, because they don't have the words, and move away from the why because they don't know why.
So instead of we talked last week about sensory detectives, I'm going to talk about emotional detectives.
Yeah, I like it.
What is driving, what is the emotion behind the behaviour? So we see the behaviour because that's what the children show you, but there's an emotion, and sometimes we don't know what it's about. We don't know that why they are in the morning not coming downstairs, not cleaning their teeth, not brushing, don't want their hair brushed, don't want to get dressed. And then we realise that there's something about leaving and separating that is actually really triggering them. And until we kind of work that out and think, I wonder if it's this, I wonder. So those are the emotional detectives, the curiosity.
Yes.
So everything we do it's almost like you have to be a detective. Which is interesting, which actually was the job I wanted to do.
I thought you was a big murder squad.
So thinking about our foster parents, like I said, I've been working with foster parents for 15 years or so now, and I see what a tough job it can be. It's not a job, but it is a professional role, and I can see how tough it is. We take some really, really fantastically skilled, well-motivated, naturally insightful people, but we're actually asking them to do a very complex task, aren't we?
Yes.
So, what can foster parents do if they're looking after a child who's experienced developmental trauma, and how can we, as other professionals, part of their professional network, kind of support them with that?
Well, I think the most important thing is what can we do for them, because they are doing a remarkable job, and it is in the relationship where healing happens. So,
but it's also in the relationship with the trauma happens.
Yes.
So when we think about foster carers, they want to build this relationship, and they've invited the child in. If you think about the trauma these kids have got, it's not a car accident trauma, it's not a dog bite trauma. It's relational trauma.
Yeah.
Trauma. So a new relationship's going to trigger them, isn't it? It's like if you've got a child got bit by a dog when they're 3, they may not remember that, but years later they see a dog in the street, they're going to get anxious, and they may not know why. It's the same thing in relationship with these foster carers.
Well, which makes it an even more complex task, doesn't it? Because there must be, thinking about triggers, or whether we're thinking about kind of alarms. The child's alarm is going to be going off the whole time. So
we talked a bit about that last week, didn't we? About that there's been a sort of emphasis over the years in foster care of pushing for attachment. These children have got to have an attachment. They've got to, and we've got to get the attachment. But actually, my argument, I think, and what you're arguing, is actually what we're doing is triggering a trauma, because a lot of these traumas are relational. So unless we work initially with the brainstem, and so one of the things that is thinking about is the knowledge that we're getting now is to think about how we work with actually the foster carers in doing the therapy through the foster carers on a very much kind of repeat. So that's kind of rhythmic and sensory, which is why we had last week, we had an opportunity to hear from Karen, who's an OT, looking at the sensory kind of input, so we can calm the brainstem and work with the brainstem before we start pushing the whole attachment journey. And obviously we do that relationally, but it is about, the first focus is more around helping the foster carer do techniques and things to change the kind of
safety.
To create safety and calmness. And it has to be on a day-to-day basis. It has to be repetitive. So it's not something you do 1 hour a week in a therapy session. It has to be on every moment, woven through their day, and setting up a kind of, with the school, the whole network, so everybody is doing the same thing, and that might be every day we roll, little Johnny in a carpet.
And we explain why we're rolling kids in carpets, Les. You can't just have a rolling kid in a carpet. Why are we rolling kids in carpets?
I roll my son quite often. He has some sensory processing difficulties, and it's a way of kind of grounding him. So, he kind of gets a grounding sensation on every part of his body. So, there are simple things like, putting a heavy rucksack on a child or getting them to sweep up something heavy manual labour. But for those children who require just kind of grounding, then rolling children in a foam yoga mat or something similar.
I'm not mad.
But I think you have to explain why you talk about rolling children.
Trauma is like clouds of sensation that mean that children are very agitated, can't put the words to it, they're all over the place, they fall off chairs, they fall off tables, they fall over, they bang into stuff. So it's about that grounding, and rolling can really regulate a child back to, like Danni says, weighted blankets or those kind of things. But obviously it has to be done with thought around the trauma when it happened, the type of trauma, but sort of working with foster carers to do all of that.
I think this, you and I have spoken about this before, but my background being in therapeutic residential childcare, and it was actually, I was fortunate enough to be in the community, so we had the school, the therapy centre, but actually, how I kind of made sense of what we were doing was that these children weren't ready to live in a family. So, that's how we used to describe it. They weren't ready to live in a family. It was the relationships that, like I said, we knew that they were re-traumatising. But actually, kind of time has moved on, and there is still a really good place for residential homes. But I think that we are able to offer that kind of response in more of our foster families now. I think we're using kind of the theory to assess and recruit foster parents differently and to support them differently. So kind of how do we take all of this and put it into a family? What does it actually look like? What do they have to do?
I think one of the things I think is that we have to help people, because for years it was like, just send the kid off to therapy.
Yeah.
And that was the view. Just sending them, got it as soon as the child comes into a new foster family, send the child to therapy, go and see someone like me for an hour a week. And I think it's about opening people's minds and changing the mindset. Because I know when I first started fostering, someone came up to me and said, "We're not going to give them therapy. We're going to roll them in a carpet." I thought, okay, you're bonkers. I'm going to ask a different social worker.
Yeah.
So it's about, I think, the first thing is educating and help people understand. And I think that is going to be a real leap of faith for a lot of foster carers.
Yeah, and it's a shift of lens on the child being the problem, to actually look and sending the child off for treatment, to actually look at the healing, and the healing happens in relationships. So we're shifting the lens into the dynamic relationship that is in the present, where we can heal.
Yeah. And
that is the difference. So that is about seeing the foster carer as the healer.
That's a really good point. It's a really good point. I think, I'm a social worker, I've been a local authority social worker, I've been an SSW, and there was a period in my work life where I thought, if a child got therapy, yes, that's the solution, all's going to be okay now. Whereas actually, you do individual work with children, so we're not saying that there's not a place for it, but we're saying that it comes at a much later stage. There is stuff that the network, the relationships, the family can do first. So I think why Succeed Partnership are so kind of enthused by our new model we're involved in developing and in having these conversations is so that understanding developmental trauma and its impact on children, particularly those children in care, is really the way forward. If we can educate the workforce, our foster parents, our social workers, we are going to put less, we're going to hang less kind of miracle hope on a therapy session, and understand that we, the professional network, the grown-ups have the opportunity of of doing this work with the children.
Yeah, and so therefore one of the things is first of all is really to help us, all of us, everybody who's working, to understand how trauma operates in systems, and how we as foster carers, as adopted parents and as professionals interact with that trauma, how it then interacts with our own childhood traumas, perhaps, if that's there, how we respond to the trauma in its present form. So it's not about focusing on, little Johnny went through that over there 10 years ago, now he's in a safe place. It's looking about how the trauma is getting enacted in the system that it's now in, and that's where we can make the change.
Yeah.
Because it's supporting the foster carers. Yeah. And it's really interesting around the three things that they've looked at sort of placements, because obviously there's huge amounts of placement burnout, breakdowns, and all of that sort of stuff. And certainly with these very traumatized children, sometimes they've had 10, 15, 20 plus placements. So that's a lot of foster carers burning out, not dismissing the child's experiences, but that's a lot of burnout from foster carers. And it's thinking of, so that the research has looked at, there's three things: there's resilience, empathy, and self-care. And interestingly, one of the things that they talk about is that the tricky thing is empathy, for instance, is one of the things that sustains a placement. At the same time, it means that the foster care is more exposed to the trauma.
Yeah.
So therefore, they can then pick up secondary trauma. Yeah. So they actually become traumatized themselves through the interaction of the trauma that the child is.
Yeah, I was hoping you would touch on secondary trauma and kind of maybe give an explanation, because I have a vague understanding of it, but I know some people have heard of it and don't really know what it is that we're talking about. You know, how can caring for a child who suffered trauma 7 years ago affect the foster parent who's looking after them?
Okay, so just a good example is of a child who's been exposed to a lot of aggression in their childhood and comes into a placement and then becomes very aggressive. And the foster carer, in order to kind of manage that aggression over time, and I'm talking, it doesn't happen instantly, it's a kind of repetitive sort of interaction, ends up shutting themselves in the bathroom because they are, in the face of trauma, actually being now organised into a flight. But what happens is the child then escalates because they experience a cut-off, which then further escalates their trauma, doesn't resolve it, and then we get into this pattern of coping strategies that might be cut off, it might be blocked care. I think that we've all experienced where foster carers have become very emotionally blocked.
Yeah.
So we've got cut off flight, they leave the house, or they'll shut themselves in a room with the child, away from the child, or they might become aggressive themselves.
Yeah.
So we've also seen that. And so they basically are in a dynamic that is caused, and so that blocked care and all of those things that can happen mean I've got lost now, my train of thought.
And I was just
Can you just explain what secondary trauma is and how can...
Another way the carer's trauma can come out, as amazing as our brains are, is that it can't tell the difference from imagination and something real. And so if you hear something, and if a child, and often these children are telling you stuff all the time, and if you hear it, and if you visualize it, the brain can perceive that as real. And I'll give you an example. I'm not somebody who's very visual. I'm just not visual. I don't visualize anything. And I was watching telly one evening, and my son, who was working at the time in a forensic unit, I'm not going to tell you what he told me, for men who'd committed horrendous crimes. He said, "Oh, Mum, I was really stressed. This happened at work." And he told me what had happened, what this guy had told him, and I visualised it. By mistake, I just visualised it. Could not get it out of my mind for ages. And so I think what foster carers can do very easily, if the child tells them something, "Oh, their daddy hit me like this, or Mum did this," they visualise it, and then if this happens over and over and over again, they become vicariously traumatised. One of the things I say to foster carers is try, if someone tells you something, always make sure you don't visualise things.
Interesting.
Because the brain just interprets it.
Yeah, and kind of creates a memory for it, so it kind of sorts it in.
So is that coping? It's the coping mechanism.
So I was interested in that. So, I have worked with foster parents before where, they do have to kind of emotionally close off, close down, shut down, and you can see it's a self-preservation kind of. But I guess what we're saying is that the relationship needs to be the healing of the trauma, which then can't happen if the foster carer has taken that.
So the focus is on supporting the foster carer. And so one of the biggest things that's coming out of research is self-care. So ensuring that the foster carer is supported constantly, week on, because unfortunately I think a lot of foster carers will only have one person going in, perhaps, I don't know what it is, Danny, on a...
every month?
Every month,
yeah.
So it's like, it can't work like that, because that means, from 1 month to the next, you've suddenly got somebody who's hiding in the bathroom every time Joey gets cross and angry, and so you're in a vicious cycle, so to speak, then, because the coping mechanism is making the behaviour worse. So the way that the foster carer is coping is increasing the behaviour.
Yeah.
So we need to work with our foster carers as detectives. We would meet with them all of the time, regularly, thinking about what is that behaviour, thinking about what could that behaviour be about, how could we as a group, and it's not one clever answer, it's working with all of us as a network with joined up experience to think about, is that maybe that's that about, we could try that, thinking about the child's history, is that something? So a good example of that is I'll use my daughter, she's in a classroom, 7 placements before she comes to me. So her experience of people leaving triggers her. So she becomes emotionally dysregulated. So she's in a classroom with 7 other children, and the teacher suddenly remembers that they've left the register in another room. So she gets up, the teacher, and just walks out of the room. So all the children look up, they see the teacher leave, but their story and their narrative is that people don't leave, they just go off and they come back. But for my daughter, the experience is people leave and they never come back. And so she's immediately has this huge sensation of emotion, and she's triggered, she's in that abandonment experience. So in order to manage that, she gets up and starts moving about because it feels really uncomfortable, and it feels really like I'm not happy, I'm really struggling.
I need to get away from this feeling.
Yeah, so she starts to try and kind of control the class, and of course the class are going to her, what are you doing? Get down, because they're all going, be like us, be like us. But she's not like them because she's experiencing something very different. So she's up kind of
trying to teach the class,
take control, because she feels out of control.
Yeah.
So the teacher marches back in, sees my daughter at the front of the class trying to take over, causing uproar because she's not very good at doing it, and they're all very unhappy that she's doing it. And so she gets sent out of the class. So what happens to that moment of that is not helping that little girl manage her regulation. In fact, what it's done is abandoned her to the outside of the classroom, in a room on her own, and so the teacher can get on.
So her kind of traumatic experience of feeling abandoned resulted in her being abandoned.
Again.
Yeah.
And I guess if the teacher had a clear trauma profile of this of her, they would have done it differently. They would have said, I'm leaving, I'm back at this time, and
can you look after this register or something until I come back?
Now I'm coming back.
So it's about tweaking, and I'm using that as an educational teacher thing, but that's the kind of playful thinking curiosity that we would want to use with foster carers.
That doesn't also make us think of how many kind of experiences children have to have or do have every single day. So, not knowing that, I didn't have a knowledge of developmental trauma when I was working residentially, but I did used to say to people, do you have any idea of how much these children have to go through just to survive the day? How many triggers, how many things they are kind of trying to hold together. And I think that about our children in care who go to school, and the idea that we're trying to get them to think about learning whilst they're trying to settle down their senses, put the alarm out, put the fire out, and everything else. So I guess I'm really interested in, we're not just leaving foster parents to get on with this, because this sounds like very complicated work. You two are very experienced trained therapists. How do these foster parents kind of just get on with it and respond therapeutically? I mean, you mentioned trauma profiling, but kind of how do foster carers get help to do this?
Well, we're intending on running support groups so that regularly that there is a sort of support group of thinking together.
But also other foster carers.
Yeah, so we're using mentoring of foster carers to foster, so other foster carers, so mentoring other foster carers. So we are creating a sort of culture of curiosity that comes with an education and understanding about what we're playing with, really. So we start to embed it, and we offer support. But the other thing that we're doing is ensuring that we work with our foster carers in a much more collaborative way. We're going to have yoga. Yoga is fantastic for kind of regulating, because if you're going to regulate a child, and I think we can all know this when we all become dysregulated, I'm the worst parent when I'm dysregulated. If I've just come in from a very stressful day at work and someone starts demanding at me, I'm going to respond to that very differently if I've been sitting reading a novel all day with my feet up and having a yoga session. So it is about regulating the regulator.
Yeah.
So, you know, offering yoga sessions. The other thing we're going to be doing is drumming, because drumming is a wonderful way. I mean, you can talk more about drumming, but it's a wonderful way to regulate.
I think we're going to do one of these around things like treatment, like EDR and drumming and all that sort of stuff in the new year.
Yeah.
Because it's quite in depth. I think one of the things that I notice around foster carers is that, being a foster carer myself, when you start fostering, a lot of your friends fall by the wayside, because suddenly when you're invited, you're bringing along this army of crazy kids. And suddenly, actually, and also other people often don't understand, and I'm sure you understand adopted parents, other people don't understand, your children will be traumatized, and they may behave slightly differently or do slightly different. So I think often to get your friendship network from other people who understand, and I think support groups are really, really powerful. And also foster carers who've been fostering for a long time. I was running a group once and I had this foster care, was a relatively new foster care, and she was really upset because she had a teenager who would wear their hoodie and would have their hoodie up at dinner, and she was finding this really difficult, saying, I keep saying, get it off, and all the foster carers were giving all these ideas and, you know, maybe bribing, maybe do this, and this old school foster care would just turn the heating on. Yeah, brilliant. Just sweating out. But it's just that knowledge where you don't have to have a fight. And you get that from other foster carers that maybe if you've not been fostering, you don't know. So I think the mentoring side of it is really helpful, because you get that support of somebody who's been there, who actually knows how incredibly rewarding, but it's
and actually, you know, our plan is for these peer mentors to be trained in empathic listening, so that, you know, they might go and give a solution, but they might not. They might just kind of go, do you know what, that sounds like that was really tough. I had something similar and it was really hard. That is key. Yeah. Because actually, just giving, you know, you need to do this, you need to do that. It's not. That's the last thing you actually need. You're absolutely right. Yeah. You need someone just to listen. And social workers are problem solvers. We like to rescue people. We like to go to the solution.
As therapists.
So the SSW goes and says, you need to do this, you need to do this. And actually what we want is, you know, kind of a foster care peer mentor, just to kind of go, do you know what? Then we put the kettle on. That sounds like that was really awful. I had 3 hours of IT problems yesterday. And the poor IT guy, I burst into tears because I couldn't cope. I was really not coping with this IT situation yesterday. But I had all this risk I had to manage. And I rang my sister. And it only took her 5 minutes just listening for me just to go blah, 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 blah. And I just completely came down. That's all I needed. I didn't need her to fix my IT. I didn't need her to do. So that's really important. And we need to, you know, and I know that there's things called listening circles and all of that kind of stuff around. And I would really echo that sort of approach. But also really understanding about self-care. Because you know, my experience with foster carers, and I've run groups with adopters and foster carers. I think adopters, and I don't want to be better or worse, but I think they're better at parking the mobile phones and not being on alarm. I find a lot of foster carers that spend their life with a phone as if at any moment, it's almost like their alarm system is on all of the time. And
possibly because they're traumatized.
Yeah. So they can't put the phone down. And so to try and run a group and say, actually, we need to park the phones, let somebody else deal with the problem for a while. I feel like some of that is our responsibility. So, you know, in terms of ours as in a fostering service, you know, having been a registered manager for a number of years, you know, we need to create a culture where foster parents are given permission not to be on call 24/7, and that, you know, because sometimes, you know, I've worked places where we've absolutely jumped on foster carers if they haven't responded the moment we phoned them, but actually,
so it has to be agency wide, not just sitting with the foster carers self-care.
Yes,
I think it has to be agency wide.
Yeah.
The agency, the social workers to understand and really support breaks, time out, looking after yourself.
So it's the whole culture.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's not to say that we might need somebody to be on high alert for this child for some reason, but if the foster parent needs to go into a reflective parenting session, you know, they can say, can you call my non-mental carer, or can you call the office? You know, so you can take control of it, not leave a gap. You know, you make sure someone's got the child in mind, but actually we need to have the foster parents in mind.
We do. And that group experience that I had, where none of them, they battled with me for the whole 6 weeks of the group about not putting their phones down.
Yeah.
Was all, to me, it was about the fact that they were not looking after themselves. And I was going, look after yourself. And they were going, no, we can't. We're on an alarm system because our child might call. It's like, well, it's an hour. That we can hand it to somebody else to do that.
Yeah.
So
maybe we need to teach the skills of,
self-care.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Research.
We can't just
is the biggest.
assume. We can't just assume people know how to self-care.
No.
Yeah.
Well, I struggle with. I am somebody who cares for others. That's my job. That's what I do, and I'm not very good at caring for myself. And that's something that I have to really work hard to do, to make sure. I mean, my sister is quite good at nudging me about it. But
really understanding, I think, it was really brought at home because of the bizarre world we live in with COVID and everything. The things that would have done on a daily basis, like when Lesley and I were working in CAMS, we'd go down and we'd walk to Asda and we'd giggle and we'd laugh. And we'd do that daily. Now we're in separate houses, just in front of computers, working with kids, whatever we're doing, Zooms, calls and all that sort of stuff. We're not having that offload, that refueling ourselves. And it's what foster carers, because of their social, they're fostering, they've got difficult children, their social circles have become limited because they've got this focus of this child, they're going to run on empty. So we have to refuel.
And also, you know, kind of research around the types of people who are more likely to become foster carers, foster parents, are the personality types of people who are out there with the capes, you know, kind of helping everyone, rescuing everyone, you know, kind of looking after everyone, being the family's therapist and, you know, kind of doing Meals on Wheels and, you know, whatever else. So they are the people who are likely to put themselves last.
Absolutely.
Which, based on what we've just been talking about, caring for a child who's experienced developmental trauma, is the opposite of what we need them to be. So
absolutely, and the research, all of the research.
That's a light bulb moment. I love it when that happens.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
What I would really like, I think, if you know, gold standard for me would have enough safety for foster carers to say, I screwed up.
Yeah.
I was rubbish last night. I shouted. I did this. I did that, and to be safe enough to also to be able to talk through. I mean, I'm not saying we need to be their therapist, but talk through that they have their own issues, and this child sometimes triggers my issues.
Yeah.
And to have that, if they, for instance, they have very rejecting, rejecting parents, and the child's quite rejecting. If we know that, we can work through it.
Yeah.
So the safety.
Absolutely, and for me, I think we will reach gold standard when everybody in the professional network feels equal.
Yes.
We all have different roles, and we are going to look at the child, the family, from a slightly different perspective, but each of our perspectives are needed to get a holistic picture. So, you know, my goal standard is when the foster parent feels that they are equally as important in this network as
they
the
see themselves as
social worker or the
professionals.
therapist. Absolutely,
So
but that
yeah.
comes from us setting the culture where they are seen as professionals.
So many network meetings I've been to, and I said, "Where's the social workers?" No, so the social workers haven't invited the foster carers because they're not professionals. I'm like, no, they are.
Well, so I, you know, I've said a bit about me and my background. I'm a social worker. I've managed fostering services for a number of years, but when I was an adopter, involved with the, you know, kind of placing of my child and the local authority, I felt very different. I was kind of looked at very differently and given a different kind of role, which was very unusual.
Not as a professional.
Unusual for me. So I'm just noticing the time. So
can I make one last
yes,
comment?
go on. Let's have a. Well, I mean, it depends if we've got any questions. We might not, but we'll pause and say, we'll get a nod. We have got some questions. Okay.
So what I just wanted to say that self-care is the key intervention with foster parents, and the research shows that placement stability, if self-care is in there, is stronger. So that was my kind of bit of research point that I wanted to make.
Thank you. Okay, so one question is around a statement we made about less trauma, meaning you can heal them quicker. I'm not sure that's exactly what we said or we meant, but maybe that's how we put it across. So we were talking about children, the amount of trauma, the amount of kind of if they were younger.
Yeah, I can help. I mean, so what I'm saying is, say for instance, you're at naught, and you spend a year in a difficult situation, that year, where the brain is most absorbent, there is more profound impact on the brain. But if you then remove that child at 1, you have more chance of intervening and changing than you do if you remove that child at 3. It's more intense, but it's more likely to be. I hope that explains what I was saying.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Thank you. Somebody else said said super useful discussion. That's good. Thank you. Speaking earlier about grounding, in your experience, has anyone had any success with weighted blankets, heavy toys, or other such products? Not sure if these have a good success rate. They're just products I see advertised often. I mean, I can talk personally. My son does have a weighted blanket, which he uses kind of when he just needs to, he says it feels like a big hug, actually. So sometimes he just has it to kind of, before bath time. Bath times are very traumatic. So we either roll him in a yoga mat, or he has a little bit of time under his blanket, weighted blanket, having his foot tickled.
I've heard really good things about them.
Yeah.
I've heard really good things about weighted blankets. I'm not sure about leather toys, but weighted blankets.
I think it depends on the child, and I think all of these things need to be looked at depending on the child, what kind of experiences they've had, because a child who's been, for instance, sexually abused may not find that smothering feeling okay, and it might just trigger them. So it is really, and what we're going to do is a very extensive assessment of the trauma, as much as we can gather, and that will be a 3-month assessment, really, gathering information about trauma and understanding the trauma.
What their triggers are.
And what the triggers are.
I mean, for me, the blanket is in a response to a sensory processing difficulty, as opposed to a developmental trauma. I mean, trying to separate the two is quite tricky, but that's kind of what we see.
Yeah.
So we use it to try and help him with things that he finds really traumatic, which is water.
Yeah.
I would also just say, I know there are some very expensive products out there. My friend's parent made one, sewed one with kind of like little beads in, so little weights. So it's, there are ways of making them, not spending money on really expensive products. Okay, somebody else said, completely agree about the discussion about self-care. It's vital that this is top down, and often we put this on carers, but don't model this as a professional group and then put it back on the carers. I absolutely agree. And that's kind of what we're saying, isn't it? I'm saying from the perspective of, we need to set a culture in our fostering services where the whole organisation is pushing people to look after themselves. The managers are looking after their staff, the supervisors and social workers are looking after foster parents. We do have to role model it, I completely agree, but we have to set it as a culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, another one. You're saying exactly what is needed for foster parents. However, foster carers are more often than not penalised for putting themselves before the child. That's what I'm saying. It needs to be culture driven.
Yes.
You need to have a fostering service where the managers recognise that self-care is absolutely kind of crucial in it's part of your role. You should have it in the job description.
It has to be part of the role, because I absolutely agree. Because
if they burn out, they've got them.
Yeah, and what we've now got research that is arguing this. This isn't something that I've just pulled out of the sky. This is research that self-care is a predictor of placement stability.
Okay. When I worked in a previous fostering service, I kind of did a thing with the staff, the supervisors and social workers, but they had to list 5 things that I would see if they were beginning not to cope very well. So they wouldn't come and say to me, I'm not coping very well, but what would I see if they weren't? So for one for one social worker, it might be that they came into the office less. That would be my way as a manager of noticing, or they might not respond to every email. There were different things, or they might eat more. They might always have kind of sugary stuff on their desk.
Yeah.
So we had this for all staff members on their staff file, just for their line manager, so that they kind of, we're asking them to be aware of what their own kind of stress indicators are, and making it a joint responsibility in that kind of supervisory relationship, if we're talking about all being relational. So maybe we need to do something with foster parents, that the supervisor and social worker is saying, look, what am I going to see? How am I going to know that you're not coping?
Well, I think it has to be embedded in the assessment right from the beginning. Is what are your coping mechanisms? What do you do when you're not coping? One of the things I know about myself is I lose things. If I'm really stressed, I start to lose things. So it's a really good indicator for me because I now know that.
Okay.
So if I've lost my purse or left my purse on the top of the car and driven off, I know that I'm stressed.
Yeah.
So it's almost kind of building a language so you kind of begin to identify those things. So it does definitely need to be embedded. It's right from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to take time to change because foster carers have come from fostering agencies where there is maybe lip service paid to you've got to look after yourself, but actually this is the expectation and you've got to be up all night doing notes, etc., etc. So you come into an organisation that we have to change. We're slowly changing perceptions and understanding, but it's safe enough to go, I don't feel that you're doing that. So
Yeah,
it's about safety.
For me, they're absolutely key because, you know, as in my role as an SSW, I remember working with just an amazing foster family, you know, who just dug in. And we used to have this question on the supervision form every month, you know, let's break this placement stability. Is it, you know, fragile, approaching breakdown or stable? And every month it'd be stable until the placement broke down. And there was like no lead up or no warning.
Yeah.
And I take that as my responsibility for not observing and noticing that things were kind of much more fragile than I was kind of hearing. So if there's a way of kind of giving permission for foster parents to feel that it's okay to say that they are struggling and that they need help.
They feel safe.
They feel safe too, yeah. So again, it's the culture, it's the network, safety.
Safety, it's on every level.
Creating safety.
We have to create safety for the children, but we have to create safety in the relationships with the foster carers, and all the staff.
Yeah.
So it's safe. So we can say, I'm exhausted, I'm screwing up.
I made a
I'm lost."
mistake. I made a mistake. And being able to make a mistake, and what can we learn? Because if we always come with this very polished view in a place where we're judged, because parenting is there's so much judgment about parenting. If we come to a place where, look, I messed up, I made a mistake, I said the wrong thing, what can I do differently? How can I learn about that? What do I need to not do it again? That's a repair, and that repair is key in every element of treatment of children who've been traumatized, treatment of looking after people, is making mistakes. Let's learn by that.
Rupture and repair.
Rupture and repair.
But all being part of that network equally, so that, you know, the foster carers don't have to be like, I can't possibly know what to do in this situation, I need to wait until my supervised social worker comes around. You know, the foster carers, I always say to them, look, you know, you are the expert in the child. Nobody else lives with them, the child, like you do. So you know your child really well. That doesn't mean that I, as a professional social worker or professional therapist, aren't able to offer a view and to give some guidance. But, you know, we're coming to you as the expert in that child. You know them better than we do. We might be able to interpret or help you understand behaviours differently. But we all need to feel empowered to be an equal part of that network, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, it's very nearly time. So somebody just said, can you share the research so we can use it more readily? I guess there's different pieces of research that you are drawing on. It's a great question, and we will. Just to say that Dr. Lesley has started to write some blogs for us, so I think we're going to launch those next year, so 2021. And so when those happen, we'll make sure that we put any links to any research there.
When they are in there, so that what I've been referring to, the references are in those blogs.
Brilliant. Okay. So, I mean, if you've got any specific questions around particular research that has been referenced today that you want to know about, please send me an email. My email is, if I can remember, ds@succeedpartnership.co.uk. This, if you're logged on today, this recording will be available hopefully next week, although Christmas in the way, we'll see, we'll try and get it done. Okay, but we need to round it up so people can kind of get off and end of their lunch break and get back to work if that's what they're doing. So Jill and Dr. Lesley, thank you so much. Thank you again for everybody who has kind of logged on and taken part today. Thank you for your questions, really good. Great to get some good feedback. And like I said, you know, Succeed Partnership and our team here feel really passionately about children in care, about us improving their outcomes, really improving their outcomes. And to do that, we feel absolutely kind of determined that we are going to contribute to the discussion and education and improving the understanding of developmental trauma across the workforce. So that's social workers, commissioners, clinical staff and foster parents. So thank you for tuning in. We promise to continue these discussions in the new year.
We're going to do one on EMDR.
We are going to do EMDR and trauma type treatments.
Yeah.
So this is just the beginning for us, and we hope that you will join us. I hope that you all have a safe end of the year, wherever you are, whatever tier you might be in. And if you celebrate it, then I hope you have a really Merry Christmas. But for now, we'll say goodbye and we'll see you in 2021.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.